I am Chris DeFay, a member of the Authors at Google team here in Venice, our Venice Los Angeles office, and I am pleased to welcome our guest, Olga Oliker, who joins us from the RAND Corporation. Ms. Oliker is based in RAND's Washington office, where she is Associate Director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center and a Senior International Policy Analyst. Her research is focused on international relations, national security policy, and the context of countries in conflict, post-conflict, transition, development, and reform. Her research examines these issues in Russia, Central Asia, the Caucasus, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries. She joins us today for a timely discussion of recent developments in Ukraine and Russia. The title of her talk is Russia, What Happened? What's Next? Please join me in welcoming Olga Oliker. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I've been asked to talk to you today about Russia, Ukraine, what's going on, what it means for the United States, and if you do tend to follow kind of U.S.-Russia relations, things like that, what you've probably noticed even without paying too much attention is that our relationship has shifted from kind of this one of general tension, a lot of cooperation, didn't seem that bad, to what seems like a standoff. And all of this seemingly because of this little peninsula in the Black Sea. So how did we get here, and where do we go now? What I'm going to do today is I'm going to break this down into 4 components, talk about each of them, and then actually I hope to have a good bit of time to hear what you all think and to talk about it a little bit. So first I'm going to talk about Ukraine, Crimea, what that's all about. Then I'd like to turn a little bit to what's happening in Russia domestically and what has happened over the last few years. Third, move back to Ukraine and what this means in the context of Russian relations with the United States. And then finally, my crystal ball has been really in bad shape throughout this entire crisis. I'm not going to make any predictions, but I can talk a little bit about what it means going forward. So first of all, what happened in Ukraine? And there's a map over there, and here's Ukraine, here's Crimea, here's Russia. I don't know if it's a political point that Russia doesn't get a label. I've noticed that you have to kind of get most of it on before it starts getting labeled, and it's so big, it's hard to do. So the way I like to talk about what's happened in the last few months in Ukraine is there are several different stories you can tell about it. Several kinds of truths, several kinds of narratives. So one story that you may have heard is that late last fall, this past fall, the people of Ukraine took to the streets to protest a corrupt, autocratic leader who had turned his back on an association agreement with the European Union and instead decided to ink a deal with Russia to bail out Ukraine's disaster of an economy. These people who came out to the streets demanded his ouster. He had his police force fire on peaceful protesters, and then he fled the country. The parliament of Ukraine was forced to put in an interim government to rule until elections could be held, and they're scheduled for May. But Russia then went and paid people to cross into Ukraine to protest the new government and used that as a pretext to grab control of the Crimean Peninsula. And it's now fomenting unrest elsewhere in Ukraine, potentially in order to invade. So that's one story. Here's another story. A mob came out into the streets to demand the ouster of a democratically elected leader in Ukraine who had made a choice to work with Russia to save a country in dire economic straits, at a time when association with the EU would have led to further austerity and hardship for large chunks of the population. That mob, egged on by the United States and European Union, which were helping finance them, included a variety of right-wing, ultranationalist groups, and they threw Molotov cocktails at police, they took police officers hostage, and they engaged in a variety of violent activity. The parliament then took a series of illegal votes, one of them being to oust the democratically elected president, and then appointed a parliament that has no legitimacy because appointed a government that has no legitimacy because, well, it was just appointed by parliament. Nobody elected them. And as a result of this, there has been chaos in Ukraine. Throughout the countries, and right-wing militias have roamed the streets and been allowed to kind of patrol and bring order. In Crimea, where there's a majority ethnic Russian population, these people, terrified of both the fascists and the prospect of future discrimination because of the ultranationalists, voted to secede from Ukraine and then chose to join Russia. In other parts of the country, ethnic Russians and Russian speakers are rising up against this illegitimate government and seeking Russian help and protection. So these aren't the only two stories out there. You can tell other stories, but they are two of the most important. Thank you. And they're two of the most important because, as I think you might have noticed, the first one is kind of one you hear from a lot of Western outlets, and the second is one that you hear from a lot of Russian outlets. And the Russian outlets include Russian television, which broadcasts into eastern and southern Ukraine, where a lot of folks, whether they're ethnically Russian or Ukrainian, speak Russian as their first language. And indeed, there's nobody in Ukraine who doesn't speak some Russian and some Ukrainian. It's not as though there are people who speak just one or the other. And the problem is that neither story is all true or all false. Yanukovych was incredibly corrupt, but then so has been every government in Ukraine since independence. He was also democratically elected. There are in fact ultra-right-wing groups in the new government, but they're far from most of it. And the interim government is trying to get control over the militias, and they've taken legal action. And in fact, the police shot one of the militia leaders recently in under questionable, or according to the police, he shot himself twice in the chest, so while resisting arrest. There's that. Some of the protesters in southern and eastern Ukraine probably are paid or at least reimbursed by Russia, and some of them may be coming from Russia. But that's not all of them, and there are enough familial ties between Russia and Ukraine that there's an argument to be made that these people do, some of them do have a voice. Some of them probably are coming from Moscow and have no relationship. And there is real nervousness and discontent in these regions. I'm not saying it's prevalent, but there are people who are nervous. The other problem is that even if you choose to believe one story and dismiss the other one, the fact is that other people in the US, in Russia, in Germany, in Poland, and in Ukraine believe the one you don't believe. And they act accordingly. So for instance, economic analysis might indicate, and kind of does, that the austerity measures called for by the EU and IMF won't actually be that bad for Ukrainians, particularly if they're instituted now, it's warm, you don't need that much gas, so all these gas subsidies aren't as big an issue. But if Ukrainians in the South and the East don't believe that, if they think that this is really going to hurt them, they're still going to oppose it. They're still not going to want it to take place. And it's a question of, will they believe the economists you trot out as opposed to the economists that somebody else trots out? So that's Ukraine, and we'll come back to it. But I'd like to also briefly talk about Russia, where the annexation of Crimea is stunningly popular, especially if you consider that a month and a half ago, nobody in Russia was thinking about annexing Crimea at all. Putin's approval ratings are through the roof. And just as Russia was consolidating control of Crimea, if you were paying attention, you might also notice that the Russian government was shutting down a few more bits of what was left of the opposition media, which has kind of been this steady process. But right around the time of the Crimea thing, the editor of the news site Lenta.ru, which it was a very good news site, I used it all the time, was fired because she had allowed for the publication of an interview with one of the Ukrainian far-right leaders, actually. And then the majority of her editorial staff resigned, and Lenta.ru was effectively gone, though they've kind of reconstituted themselves a bit. Now, Russian news media was already pretty tightly controlled. And most people in Russia don't mind, right? They're fine getting their news from the Kremlin-approved television stations. So where the opposition media mostly works is they're preaching to the choir. They're talking to people who are looking for that sort of information. So shutting them down is kind of a bit of insult to injury. It's basically saying, yeah, we know no one's listening to you, but we don't want you to have access anyway. And it's kind of also worth noting that as of today, Voice of America, the US-funded, it's a US government agency, broadcasts in Russia have been told their license wasn't going to be renewed, and they're no longer going to get their little AM band to broadcast on. The political opposition in Russia hit its height a couple of years ago, winter 2011, kind of on the eve of the March 2012 election that brought Vladimir Putin back to power. Tens of thousands of mostly middle-class Russians came out to the streets because they weren't real happy with the fact they didn't have a real choice in this presidential election, that they felt that this wasn't real, that this wasn't right. Putin still won, And he probably would have won. There are talks about how the election was doctored. He would have won. It wasn't that he wasn't popular, but he was nervous as a result of this. He looked out at all these people who he thought about as, all their wealth, their comfort, their ability to go to sushi bars and coffee shops. That was because of him. He was the one who had presided over a decade of strong economic growth for Russia. He was the reason there was a middle class. And what is with this, why aren't they grateful? Why are they instead coming out in the streets demanding his ouster, well, not even his ouster, but, demanding a choice, demanding that somebody else be able to run? Oh, well, we've lost our map. Okay. So because he was nervous, he instituted this campaign against the opposition, and it's kind of been a slow but steady process of arrest, harassment, significant limits on what the opposition can do. For instance, if you read in the papers about a protest with 50,000 people in Russia, what you don't necessarily read is that in order to get their permit to protest, they had to say exactly where they're going to be. It's kind of closed off. The only people who show up are the people who've shown up to protest. So it's not as though you're kind of in the middle of the street and anybody can come by and watch and listen and join. It's really, these are the people who know about it and who can show up. And in the meantime, the other thing that Putin's nervousness has led him to is he's making his decisions speaking to fewer and fewer people. I mean, this is something that everybody who watches this agrees, that he's not listening to a broad range. His foreign minister probably doesn't have a lot of influence over what it is Putin decides to do. And you can see this, for instance, in this crisis, where you had other Russian officials saying, Russia will, of course, respect Ukraine's sovereignty. We have no intention of doing anything. Oh, hey, look, we took Crimea. That's, yeah. And, it's because nobody told them. We even have every reason to think that he's flying by the seat of his pants on some things, including this. But we also have no way to influence it, and it's dangerous because what he's doing is he's closing himself off to a very real debate that does go on, that that you can hear and you can access amongst Russian thought leaders, but he's not listening to them. So the bottom line is you have an incredibly popular Russian president making decisions without broad consultation and an opposition that's fragmented and weak. At the same time, you have a knowledge that there is a core of dissatisfaction. It's not that surprising that opinion ratings are really high right now. If you look at the opinion ratings for George Bush right after the invasion of Iraq, they were very high as well. People tend to rally around the flag when these things happen. So the knowledge that tens of thousands of people did come out onto the streets in winter of 2011, and it's cold in winter in Russia. I mean, coming out into the streets to protest in winter, Ukraine too. I mean, that is saying something. That means that there is something there that could be harnessed and could respond even with all the propaganda. So let's turn back to Ukraine and the US-Russia relationship. The US, its European allies, responded to the annexation of Crimea about as you'd expect. They said that it was illegal. They said it was improper. They put sanctions on Russia. And, indeed, it's pretty illegal. And not only is it illegal, and it's illegal in part because you don't violate sovereignty, and this has been Russia's big soapbox for years, is sovereignty is important. So it's a little odd. And then Russia also signed the Budapest Agreement back in the early 90s, committing to Ukraine's sovereignty very specifically. So, it's pretty illegal. But the US and Europe haven't said, we're therefore going to take up arms against you. They've said, we're going to sanction, we're very unhappy. This makes us rethink our relationship. And of course, as Putin made clear in his speech on March 18th, when he did talk about the annexation of Crimea and did try to justify it and say that it was in fact legal, this isn't really just about Ukraine. That thread in the Russian narrative about Western support for the activists that overthrew Yanukovych is an important thing to remember. Because from Russia's perspective, what happened in Ukraine over the last few months, just like what happened in Ukraine in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, and what happened in Georgia in 2003 with the Rose Revolution, and indeed the opposition protests in Russia a few years ago, these are foreign-funded efforts to weaken Russia, to prevent its exercising its natural influence in countries on its periphery, and to kind of grow in global influence as well. And, thinking thing about these countries on its periphery, you have to remember, it's not just that they were part of the Soviet Union. These countries are part of Russian Empire. Russia hasn't bought into the notion that these are countries, and in the case of Russia itself, people, making independent choices. The way Russia sees this is it's in competition with the United States for influence and control in these areas. And this isn't a Putin thing, right? You hear people say, oh, it's Vladimir Putin, and some of it is, but this part isn't. You can go back to the Yeltsin era, you can go back to 92, 93, and everywhere, every Russian strategy document, threat of NATO enlargement, the need to protect ethnic Russians outside of Russia, and how important the neighborhood is to Russia. They're there again and again and again. And Ukraine particularly is very central because, as Putin indicated in his speech, the histories of Russia and Ukraine are incredibly intertwined. And they're intertwined in ways that, not that surprisingly, are viewed differently from the two countries. Again, you have different stories. For Russia, Ukraine was always, for the most part, kind of different borders at different times, but Ukraine's part of Russia. And it's Russia's hinterland, it's the provinces. It's not it's not a separate country with links to Russia, it's part of Russia. Russians think of the Ukrainian language as a form of Russian spoken by people who don't speak Russian that well. And for Ukrainians, Ukraine has a proud independent tradition. Okay, so it hasn't been an independent state for very long, and before that it was an independent state for a very brief period in the middle of a world war once. But they are a people, they are a nation, they have a language, and they've been oppressed by the Russians, even if they do come from many of the same roots, which some Ukrainian nationalists question, but I think linguistically that's a tougher one to counter. So what this means is the possibility of loss of influence in other post-Soviet states is bad. The possibility of not having sway over Ukraine is anathema. I mean, it's crazy, it doesn't make sense. So for Russia, it's about Ukraine, which is really important, and it's about the United States and fighting the US for influence and its neighborhood. And then what? Because that's one of the questions I think we're grappling with. Is it kind of just about Ukraine? Is it just about the neighborhood? Or is this part of Putin's effort to build up a global role for Russia? Sometimes in cooperation with the US, sometimes in opposition, but we have seen Russia playing more and more of a role. So is this Russia flexing its muscles? And if it is, what's it going to do with them after it's flexed them? Because one of the things that I think has, what has shocked people, what has confused people about Crimea specifically is that before these events of the last few weeks, the general view was that Russia wanted influence in the region, not territory. But it's just taken territory. And it's put troops near Ukraine's border, put them back, and there are troops that are stationed there normally, and da-da-da-da. But, some stuff moved. And then there are the protests in Ukraine, and there is clear evidence that Russians are involved in them. And then Putin's really nationalistic speech about Crimea, you start wondering, maybe he does want more. And you're seeing this debated. And if they do want more, do they want Ukraine? Do they want Transnistria and then Moldova? Or does it go further? And for the US and for its European allies in NATO, well, if they don't want Russia to go further, it's not because of Ukraine itself. They don't, this may sound harsh, but they don't actually care about Ukraine specifically. They care about the principle. They're worried about the possibility that it means more than Ukraine. But where Ukraine is concerned, they have no alliance commitments to Ukraine. They have no promises to protect it. This is annoying and a bummer and difficult, but if it's just Ukraine, that means something very different from if it's broader than Ukraine, particularly if it actually does hit NATO's borders, because that's where you do have alliance commitments. And of course, Poles, Romanians, and the Baltic states, who are the closest and who are the ones that might have reason to think that Russia has designs on them, get really nervous. And then we get really nervous because these are our allies. We do have commitments to them.
Sorry, is everybody there along the Russian border in NATO except Ukraine? Who's
these guys are in NATO. NATO. So Belarus isn't, Ukraine isn't, Moldova isn't, Georgia and Azerbaijan that we're getting out of Europe aren't. But the Romanians are. So you're kind of NATO Europe over here, non-NATO Europe over there. And one of the things I've been watching over the last few years is how the definition of Central and Eastern Europe has shifted over the last 20 years, right? It used to be that this was Central Europe. Now this is Central Europe. And, you know, people seem to argue about whether or not Russia is Europe geographically. You know, the Ural Mountains is Europe. But, you know, there is also this confusion. So is Eastern Europe now just Russia? It's also, it's a fascinating question of linguistics. And the problem with this is that if you are talking about some sort of military conflict with Russia, well, the nuclear shadow hangs over any military conflict with Russia. And this makes everybody pretty nervous. Not that they actually think nuclear war is going to happen, but you know what? No one actually thought that Russia was going to annex Crimea either. So where do we go from here? I think there's no question that what's happened changes the nature of US and European relations with Russia. But to what extent depends largely on what Russia does next. There are a lot of people who would blame the US for these events. I mean, you hear a lot of things of, did we get this wrong? How did we get this wrong? But you know, it's not particularly clear to me that I can point to a policy that we could have had over the last 20 years that would have gotten us somewhere else. You know, some people, and you know, just to kind of underline this, Thomas Friedman has a piece in today's New York Times that says that we were too hard on the Russians in the early 90s, shouldn't have pushed NATO enlargement. Other people say we weren't hard enough on the Russians, we didn't demonstrate to them, you know, how important this stuff was, we should have let Ukraine into NATO. So you hear both of these things. But the fact of the matter is, Russian positions on this were always pretty clear, that this is their neighborhood, this is their sphere of influence, and beyond that, unclear. And while what Washington and Brussels were trying to do during this period was help create the conditions where Russia would get to a point where the independence of its neighbors didn't feel threatening to it. That it was integrated into the community of nations, that it had more to lose than to gain from action like this. And I think they thought they'd kind of gotten there, but they turned out to be wrong. That doesn't mean that there was an obvious better solution, it just means that it didn't work out quite the way people hoped. So I would say that if Russia doesn't take any further military action, we're in for a long and difficult period. Not a Cold War. The Cold War, some of you may remember, was two countries that were juxtaposed against each other, and everything they did was informed by how the other would respond. Everything they did was partly geared to how the other would respond. The United States couldn't care less what Russia thinks about most of its policies anywhere. Russia cares what the United States thinks, but the United States doesn't, and this doesn't change that because there's no particular reason for it to. Russia just isn't that important to us globally. As the president said, it's a regional power, not a global power. The problem is the region's Europe, and we care a lot about Europe, but that's an aside. But it's going to be tense, and Russia might behave a little bit as though it's a Cold War situation, and it has long looked for opportunities to tweak the United States where it could, and that's not going to stop, and it's going to be difficult. And for Ukraine itself, it's going to continue to be a mess. In the lead up to these elections, if Ukraine manages to have these elections, there's going to be a lot of effort to keep it chaotic, to influence the election process. And you know, what the Russians are pushing for now is basically for them and the United States to sit down at a table and write Ukraine a constitution and force it on Ukraine. And their argument is that the interim government isn't legitimate, so they can't be part of this. The US and Europe push back and say Ukraine must be involved. We're going to just keep seeing this, and it's going to be messy, and it's going to be ugly, and it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine. And then for us and for the Europeans, kind of staying the course through a difficult process is going to be hard because there are two camps, I would say, in both the US and in kind of NATO Europe, which have two very opposite lines of thought that are both kind of dangerous. One is nostalgia for the status quo of, I don't know, say last summer, where things were okay with Russia. And the idea is that, okay, fine, so we give them whatever they want in Ukraine, and then we can start moving the gas back, and we don't have to impose these sanctions that are inconvenient for us too, and we can just go back to where it was because we liked it the way it was. And then the other is the people whose nostalgia goes further back, who really are nostalgic for the Cold War, and who would like kind of a nice, clear enemy, and who'd like to make it all about Russia and all about beating Russia down and punishing Russia, and how many other ways can we find to make things worse for Russia, which will not, in the long term, really advance a lot of US goals for European security. So that's what I think happens. So I think kind of bouncing between these two things and Having a very long and difficult process of coordinating policy is what happens if we stay at this stalemate. If Russia does take military action, well, I actually think what happens if Russia takes military action is it's going to find that this is pretty self-defeating. If Russian forces are fighting their Ukrainian brothers, I'm not sure how well that plays in Kharkov and Khabarovsk, and for that matter, Moscow and St. Petersburg. And this won't be Crimea. East and southern Ukraine are very different. Most people there aren't ethnic Russians. Even of those who are, an IRI poll just released found that about 2/3 of the ethnic Russians in Ukraine don't feel particularly under threat. In fact, fewer than 30% do think that there's any threat at all to them. Most southern and eastern Ukrainians, again, well over 60%, have no desire whatsoever for Russian military troops in their region or in their country. So if Russia takes military action in Ukraine, it's not sanctions from Europe and the United States that are going to punish them, it's the effects of doing this. And there are definitely those in Russia who recognize this. The question is whether Putin and his inner circle do. And the other question is whether Russian traditional views of Ukraine and kind of this inability to recognize Ukraine as separate will undermine rationality in this case. So I'm going to stop there, and I want to hear what you all think, and discuss this.
Okay, so we're happy to take questions, but let's please pass the mic to the person who's going to do the question. You're right here.
Hi.
Should be on.
Hi. Hello.
It's working, even though it's not.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, so one thing that like, for example, when I hear these discussions, one thing that I think is lost is the fact that people in Crimea actually voted to be like attached to Russia. So, I know how I'm Iranian, so I know how governments can like manipulate news and change the way that people see the news. But I think like it says something when most of the people in that peninsula voted to actually be attached to Russia. And when I read the news and I see like 2 or 3 other cities, Donetsk, or when I hear that again there are some pro-Russian like groups of people that actually want to attach to Russia. So I think like, and I've heard from one of my friends that there are actually 2 groups of people, some in Ukraine, not related to U.S. or Russia, who actually some of them want to, like they're pro-Russian and some are not. So I think like it's more about like what Ukrainian people think than like, what U.S. wants there or what Russia wants there.
Okay.
And,
go ahead.
Sorry, and the people who voted, yeah, there are some people who came from Russia for protests, but I think the people who voted were actually Ukrainians. That like. Okay.
So Crimea is weird. Crimea is about 60% ethnically Russian. Crimea also has a population, about 25% of a indigenous population, or fairly indigenous, indigenous varies year to year. Yes, called the Crimean Tatars, who were expelled from their home region after World War II by Stalin, forced to go to Uzbekistan. Lots of them died along the way, weren't allowed to come back, weren't rehabilitated and allowed to come back until the 1980s. Those people boycotted the referendum. So the Crimean Tatars are very nervous about the possibility of Russian rule as a people and felt that the referendum was not valid and not something that was going to respond. Now, beyond that, there is this question of how do pieces of countries secede? When the Soviet Union fell apart, the Soviet Constitution actually had laid out very clearly how republics could secede. And they all actually did that. They followed these rules, including Ukraine. Ukraine's constitution didn't really have this. But generally speaking, there is a thing, countries have borders. And generally speaking, there are bits of countries that are unhappy with that. And, there are movements to secede, and sometimes eventually that happens over time. You've got Scotland doing that. But in Crimea, that's not what you had. It's not as though Crimeans last year were thinking, gosh, it would be nice to rejoin Russia. It is very much a product of what happened in the last few months and the Russian news media and the propaganda campaign that created this environment. So there's a reason that these processes are usually time-consuming. There's a long lead-up. There's a lot of discussion. You didn't have any of that. This was very sudden. And then this is even just taking out of the equation 82% of Crimeans voted, with 97% of them. We know 82% of Crimeans didn't vote because we know that the Crimean Tatars boycotted the election. and I'm really 97%. So there's a lot of questions about whether the referendum is in any way valid. So, yes, self-determination is great, but self-determination is usually pretty well controlled globally. And in this particular case, there's a lot of reason to wonder just how self-determined it really was.
So you started your talk with describing two different views of what's going on. And of course, when people disagree or two countries disagree, there's always two views which are not exactly the same. I think the question I have is, in your opinion, which of those views have more legitimacy or more aligned with reality for some definition of reality?
I'd rather not take one. I mean, I'd actually, I think that to understand what's going on, you have to understand that these are the views because they drive how people think. And then you can draw your own conclusions about what's really going on. And I would argue, I'm sorry, it's kind of postmodernist, but my views too, they're based on who I believe, who I don't believe, who I listen to, who I don't, what news sources I trust, which news sources I don't trust. So, kind of when I ran through this, that yes, of course he was corrupt, but he was also democratically elected. I don't think that protests are a great way to change governments. Sometimes it happens, but overall, that's not a sign that you have a healthy democracy. It's a sign that you're still working towards it. And if you keep having protests to change governments, that's not good. I think the parliament's choice to oust Yanukovych and put in a new government was of questionable legality, though. I've heard another storyline that says that the fact that Yanukovych's own party voted for this was actually their way of subverting the process to make sure it wasn't legitimate so that it would continue. So, conspiracy theories everywhere. But I also think the Russians are fomenting unrest. And I also think that there is a real danger from right-wing groups in Ukraine's government. And I also think Ukraine needs to develop, if Ukraine is going to succeed, it's going to be better off with economic reform, which probably won't hurt as much as people think. And that it's going to need to be economic reform and political reform that encompasses the whole country, including the East and South. It can't ignore the interests and concerns of these people. So my view is you have to take a little from column A, a little from column B, and then a few things from just a few other places to put together a truer story. But I also recognize that all histories are at least somewhat biased.
But do you have a storyline which you think is more correct, even though you don't want to reveal it, or?
Well, I think I told you my story. No, I think I just tried to tell you my storyline.
We'll go down here.
My question is about Gazprom.
Okay.
So what's your think of the prospect of Gazprom in all this geopolitical tension?
Gazprom, the company, in the sense of, will it make a lot of money off of this, or will it lose a lot of money, or will the sanctions hurt it in the long run?
Where it be negatively somehow impacted or nationalized totally?
The joke about Gazprom is that it's not always clear whether it's that Gazprom has influence over the Russian government or vice versa. It's talking about nationalization of Gazprom ignores kind of the very tight links between Gazprom and the government. I don't think they need to nationalize it. I don't think they have any.
Gazprom might privatize the Russian government.
Gazprom could privatize the Russian government potentially. I think over time, if the Europeans do shift away from Russian gas, that will not be good for Gazprom. What Ukraine really needs to do is institute some energy efficiency. I mean, even a few just moves towards metering and being a little more efficient with their use of energy, and they'd be supplying themselves. They wouldn't need Russia at all. And that would also hurt Gazprom, even with all these reduced rates. But the thing that hurts the Russian gas industry in the long term is failure to invest in infrastructure over time and continuing to rely on a lot of really old infrastructure and kind of looking for new routes and new customers rather than thinking about ways to do things better. So, overall, yes, if this goes forward, Gazprom won't be in good shape, but there's still a lot of Russian gas and people will still buy it. So I don't think it's the end of the world. I think where Gazprom runs into trouble over time is failure to invest.
China's been surprisingly reticent in all this. You would think, given Tibet, for instance, they would be rather opposed to redrawing borders. But what is your take about the long-term interests of China? in this conflict?
Given Tibet, they'd be opposed to redrawing borders. Given Taiwan and all those islands, they might be for it. Kind of like Russia, and actually kind of like everybody. You know, your interests vary depending on the particular piece of geography you're looking at. I've heard different things come out of different people's conversations with Chinese officials and Chinese analysts. One view is that, you know, their abstention in the UN means that they've got Russia's back. I've never quite heard of abstentions meaning you have somebody's back before, but okay. Another is that they are quite nervous because of Tibet, and they are, you know, they don't like this. Russia and China have had a very odd relationship over the last, well, over a long time, you know, from the Soviet Union. But if we just look at Russia, independent Russia, that on the one hand, they cooperate and coordinate a lot because they do have a lot of shared views. One of those shared views has traditionally been about the importance of sovereignty, though, so this is a little difficult. But they also really distrust one another and have consistently. So it's always been a very fraught relationship. And if you look at how Russians view China, there's kind of a split. There are people who think that China is Russia's most important ally, and there are people who think the Chinese are just biding their time until they decide to grab a big chunk of Russia's Far East. And in China, it's a little more difficult to parse this, but I think you have similar split between those who think that Russia is a good partner and those who don't. So this is not a great answer because it's an I don't know answer. But I think in general the Chinese are nervous about this, and they're going to watch how it plays out.
Given the strategic importance of Crimea and the largely Russian population, looking back to when the Soviet Union was falling apart and the borders were getting drawn, how did it end up part of Ukraine instead of Russia anyway?
Okay. Can we get the map back? So I think, first of all, I think the strategic importance of Crimea is overstated. It was extremely strategically important, you know, during the Crimean War, which was a while ago. But if we look at the map.
Google itself has a very nice map.
This is a Google map. This is Google Maps. Well, we can zoom into Crimea. Let's go to Crimea, and let's go to the whole Black Sea. Can I get? I want to get the whole Black Sea in. Okay, great. Thank you. And then we need to get it on the screen. Okay. So this is the Black Sea. To get out of the Black Sea, you got to go through here. It's pretty closed off. So you hear a lot about how Russia has kept its Black Sea fleet here. It's very important, and the fleet is based in Sevastopol here. And indeed, it's a nice port. It's, you've got good access and so forth. But Russia has been hedging against the loss of access to Crimea for a long time. The way it's continued to have its Black Sea fleet there is it's kept signing these leases with Ukraine over and over again. And Ukrainian governments, even ones that were ostensibly Western-leaning, have agreed to keep it there. But they knew that this might not last forever, so they've actually, for the last few years, been building up facilities in Novorossiysk here, which isn't as handy, right? You don't have quite as much space around it, but it's not bad, and it's doable. So that's one piece of it. And this is purely military. It's not like there's a lot of trade going in and out of Sevastopol. So the other thing that I would point out is the Black Sea Fleet is the smallest of Russia's fleets, and it's not in great shape. So it's not as though, unless you count the Caspian Flotilla, which is also on the Black Sea. So it's not as though Russia was putting a lot of resources and energy into keeping this there for strategic reasons. I mean, kind of if you look at a map, you wonder to do what exactly that it couldn't do some other way, or from Novorossiysk if it needed to. So then the history. In 1954, for a long time, Crimea in the Soviet Union was actually autonomous and didn't belong to anybody. And then it belonged to Russia. And then in 1954, Khrushchev, as premier, decided to give it as a brotherly gift to the Ukrainian people, thinking that this meant pretty much nothing, because although Ukraine had a vote at the UN and so forth, it was part of the Soviet Union, just like Russia. So this was kind of a meaningless gesture of something. And there's a lot of debate as to what he was thinking, and you can find lots of different stories, and nobody really knows. In 1991, 92, when the Soviet Union was splitting up, a lot of people assumed that Russia would take Crimea back because the Black Sea Fleet was there. It would be easier. It just seemed, they didn't. I, for one, was surprised at the time. I thought that they would. And I think a lot of it had to do with just weakness, trying to get this done, trying to draw the borders. Fine, we got it. You want your own country. Here it is. And there were all sorts of deals initially for the fleet, that Ukraine and Russia would both hold on to the fleet, and then Russia held on to the fleet. So I think in many ways it's an accident of history, but it's an accident of history that wasn't that important. And I would argue it's still not important. It's still important now more as an accident and an opportunity than because of Crimea itself being important.
How much does the rest of the Ukraine care about Crimea? I mean, I've seen very little protests on the streets of Kiev about losing Crimea, and I can even imagine that a lot of pro-Western people in the Ukraine are almost happy to get rid of this Russian stronghold.
No, I think Ukrainians are pretty pissed off about the loss of Crimea. Kind of, yeah. The IRI poll found that the vast majority of them did not think that, and by vast majority I mean well into the 80th percentiles, did not think that this was that the referendum was valid. Don't think that the Russian action was valid. They are angry. They can't do an awful lot about it, right? And it terrifies them because they're terrified the Russians are going to move into more of Ukraine. But yeah, I wouldn't say they were eager to lose Crimea.
Okay, so I have two questions. The first is about Crimea's status within Russia. So is it going to be an autonomous state within Russia? And particularly, what's going to happen to minorities there who sum up 40% of the population, particularly Ukrainians, using their language, etc.? So what's the foreseeable future about that? That's one. The other is this whole operation seems to be very professional, done by the Russians, unlike their previous operations, military operations, and also the elections. So it's really hard to believe that this just happened all of a sudden. Do we have any data about Russians planning this, maybe for years?
So Crimea's status. Crimea has historically been autonomous wherever it's been and had a lot of autonomy, and the reason for that was primarily, or the excuse for it was the Tatars as the indigenous ethnic population, that kind of they should have their own state, or stateling. I think how Russia treats Crimea is a great question, and to be completely honest with you, I'm more nervous about the Tatars than I am about the Ukrainian population, because they have such a history of being oppressed, and because right now still people who came back are not living under the best of conditions. There's still questions about their access to land and housing. So since Russia came in to protect people's human rights, I mean, I'd say it's a very important test of what that means, how they treat both the Ukrainian population and the Tatar population. Then the Russian military. So first, I would say that militaries plan for all sorts of things, and they have tons of plans on the books for everything. And just because they have a plan means nothing about what they're actually intending to do or not. So did they have some sort of plan for Crimea? Maybe. Was it this? I think probably aspects of it, because what you actually do when you implement these plans is you take something from here and something from there and you pull them together, because the actual situation is never quite what you expect it to be. I don't think of Crimea as a military operation, though. I think of it as a political operation, which was backed by force. But it's not as though the Russian armed forces were called on to do an awful lot other than stand around with guns and unmarked uniforms looking kind of mean. So, it's not as though they faced it's not as though they faced really opposition. The Ukrainians were trying very hard not to provoke anything, so they didn't particularly fight back. So it's not like I think it's a great propaganda operation. I think it's a really impressive political operation, but I don't think it tells me much about how the Russian military does, other than the fact that it can send people who will follow orders. And I knew that it could do that before, particularly with elite forces. And honestly, from Georgia, I knew that it could do it even with the rank and file, because even if the Russians weren't that happy with how they did in Georgia, most of the reasons they weren't happy were about combined arms and the use of technology, not about their people being able to follow order and behave professionally, which they pretty much did. So we already knew. So kind of my bottom line is I do think the Russian military is better than it used to be. And my guess is it's even better than it was in Georgia. But just how good it is, Crimea is no test of.
I have a question. I have a couple Russian friends. They live in this country. They've been here for like 15, 20 years, and they're educated, U.S. universities. And so whenever something happens with Russia, I like ask them for their opinions. And basically, like when I asked my friend what he thought about Crimea, he said, I'm no fan of Putin, but Russian speakers there are under threat. And so he's basically like repeating the same propaganda that we hear from Russian television.
As opposed to the propaganda we hear from American television.
Yeah, well, like my question is like, to me that just seems absurd because I think that it is propaganda, and my question is basically like, is there any legitimacy to that? Are the Russian, like, were the Russian speakers in Crimea ever like under threat? Do we have evidence of that at all?
Yeah, I don't think they were under any kind of physical threat. I think it was kind of, there was this concern that, oh my God, there are ultra-rightists patrolling the streets of Kiev, which there kind of were, and what is this going to mean for me longer term? That a lot of these groups, particularly the ultra-right groups, have said virulently anti-Russian and also anti-Semitic, and I can't imagine they're fond of the Tatars things. But most people are kind of willing to accept that the government would not be dominated by these people. Now, I think that's still, it's dangerous, it's a concern, but that is very much what the Russian media include, and look, if you're from Russia and you read Russian news sources, again, you can pick and choose which ones you read. Just like in the United States, you can watch Fox News or you can watch MSNBC and you can kind of hear a story you expect to hear. There are Russians who don't think this, including in Russia. They get their news elsewhere. But it's not that shocking, and it comes from a grain of truth. And I've talked to Ukrainians who say that they were concerned, maybe not concerned for their lives, but concerned for the economy, concerned about the effects of the EU association agreement. And then again, this IRI poll, I said most people don't feel under threat, but some people do. So, 30% is a lot. 30% is a lot. Less than 30, really, but yeah, it's kind of in the high 20s. But yeah, it's people do. And it's, some really feel under threat and some think maybe threatened, so it breaks down further. But there's a nervousness, and why wouldn't there be, given what they've been fed? And I'm nervous about the ultra-right-wing groups in Ukraine's government too. I mean, I think that it's very important for Ukraine to find ways that they don't dominate the discussion.
Sorry, when you say the news that they've been fed, because they can hear both sides of the story.
Sure, but you have to look for it, don't you? I mean, I have a Twitter feed, right? I try to keep the news on my Twitter feed balanced from different sources. But I also know that I believe some people and I don't believe others. I mean, I have a bias in how I read it. And I have friends who watch Fox and I have friends who watch MSNBC. The only reason they would hear the other is if somebody's pointing out how silly something is. I mean, I don't think this is unique to Russians. I think Americans do this too. I think one of the effects of kind of this broad access to information is we can pick and choose what information we hear.
I wanted to move a little bit to the West, and I haven't heard much about Europe. And watching the BBC, they seem to be pretty light and not very aggressive in their language. So what's going on with them, and what Europe's thinking about this?
Crap, sorry. Oops. What are Europe? So it depends on what you mean by Europe, right? Romanians would really like F-16s and a lot of U.S. forces. Missile batteries would also be nice. Germans don't actually want to change their energy mix, and it's going to be a big hassle. And if you have to impose sanctions, I mean, God, it's going to be a big deal. Why did the Russians have to do this now? This is kind of what. So you get different views in different parts of Europe, and where you stand depends on where you sit. I think there is in Europe a nervousness about the possibility of Russia going further. But it is kind of this story I told before. There's the people who are nostalgic for the situation before the Russians did this annoying thing, and then there are people who are nostalgic for the Cold War. And probably the further west you get, the more they're nostalgic for how things were a few months ago, and the further east you go, They've been telling us all along that the Russians are dangerous. We should have paid attention. So that's how Europe is looking at it. But kind of in terms of going forward, I think maintaining a European consensus on sanctions will be difficult, particularly in the West, because it does hurt them too. Now they can adjust, but they don't necessarily want to.
Hi, so I'm Ukrainian, so I kind of care about the topic. And I wonder...
A little bit?
I try to stay away from propaganda, but what can be done to improve the situation in Ukraine, kind of have it be stronger?
Ukraine needs to have these elections and needs to make them as free and fair as possible and to make sure that the people from the East and South are represented. It does not by any means have to move to the sort of federalism Russia is suggesting, but I think direct election of governors is a nice move as opposed to having them appointed from the center. You know, it does give people more of a voice. It is going to need to move forward on economic reforms, but it's going to need to do it in a way that reassures people who feel they're going to be hurt by them that they won't be, including by offering some sorts of subsidies and so forth. But to do this, it's going to need a lot of support from Europe and the United States and financing. I mean, we're going to have to bankroll this. And this creates a real tension because how do you bankroll something like this while still holding these people accountable for both political and economic reforms? You can't keep bankrolling them if they don't do it. And for the last 20 years, Ukraine has been very good at signing on to things with the EU, with Russia, with whoever else, and then not following through. So, I mean, I think that will be a challenge. It is possible that this crisis has been sufficient that Ukraine's next government will pull this off. But it's tough because the business interests and the corruption in that country, they go so deep. And most of the people running for office are still tied to that. And their ability to cut themselves off from these very lucrative deals, it's going to be tough.
Yeah, I wonder if there's any known ways to fight corruption, like globally or from inside or from outside. What, like, because there have been places where it was really corrupt and somehow it went clean.
It's a long process. I think the one thing we know about overcoming corruption is that it takes real economic growth and it takes time. And sometimes that time is not quite generational close to it. Kaka Bentukidze, who's a former Minister of Economics in Georgia, said that what Ukraine needs is 3 people. It needs somebody who's going to jail everyone who needs to be jailed. It needs someone who's going to protect that person politically, and then it needs somebody else who's going to protect the both of them. So you know, it's. I think that's fighting corruption requires governments making a decision not to be corrupt and sticking to it. It's really difficult to fight corruption from outside and kind of impose these rules. It tends not to work.
Okay. Thank you very
much. All right.
Thanks.